Hello and welcome. This is AMN Plus Talk to Addis program. I'm your host, Arula Brahani. In our today's program, I just have invited a prominent professor. He is a professor, a senior researcher in sustainable economics and development. Do stay with us. Professor, welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
Good. So, to begin with, my first question, how do you assess the current macroeconomic situation of Ethiopia, given the different indicators, like, for example, the unemployment rate might be, the inflation, the GDP? What can you say in this regard?
Well, you see, the Ethiopian economy is facing many challenges. There is no question about it. From the Popular Front, we have very serious inflation. It's been about 30%, now it's gone down 16%. But 16% is still a lot. Any inflationary pressure more than 2% is dangerous for the economy. So both the monetary policy institutions and the fiscal policy from the House of Representatives are trying to modulate this to bring it down to at least less than 10%. The other challenge, of course, is in the country we have a lot of issues with public security, and therefore they also add to the economic challenge that we have in the country. We have also more serious problems that we can tackle. One is, of course, corruption. The public institutions, the level of corruption we have. I've served as the chairman of the advisory board for the African Union on anti-corruption, and this is unprecedented what we see today in Ethiopia, and therefore that adds another challenge to the economic development of the country and the well-being of citizens. The other problem is the illicit financial flows and illegal trade like contraband, which are dominating the black economy. So given all this, the economy is facing very, very serious challenges. Of course, the government now has launched serious macroeconomic reforms. One is, of course, in almost half a century, we have now capital markets. The Ethiopian Stock Exchange has started trading yesterday. The National Bank of Ethiopia has come with a new monetary policy, specifically floating the birr on market rates and also floating interest rates on market rates. The government has also now created an act of parliament where foreign banks can come into the country. The Council of Ministers have come up with a legislation in which foreign companies can participate in trade and development work in Ethiopia. So all these are major changes. For me, these are revolutionary in a sense, because in the last 50 years, we never had capital markets. The monetary policy has been quite restricted. The financial sector has been restricted only to Ethiopians and Ethiopian nationals. And therefore, these are ground-breaking changes that I see today in terms of policy change. And I'm hoping that the new pillars of a market economy are being built on a firm stand now. The capital markets, the entry of foreign banks into Ethiopia, the legislation coming up from the fiscal policy, and of course the monetary policy coming from the National Bank of Ethiopia.
Good. Let's come to the key challenges and opportunities of Ethiopian macroeconomy that you expect policy makers should address in the next 5 to 10 years. Apart from what you have said, what are the key challenges and opportunities that you envisage in Ethiopian macroeconomy, which could be valuable input for policy makers to be considered?
Well, you see, economic governance is the central issue now in Ethiopia. When we talk about economic governance, we have, of course, the fiscal policy that's legislated by the Council of, by the House of Representatives. This involves budgets, taxes, and these are macroeconomic policies that shape the economic sector. And then, of course, you have the monetary policies coming from the National Bank of Ethiopia. In terms of policy now, we have the policies in place. There is no question about it. But these policies also bring in a lot of pressure on the community. Like the devaluation of the Ethiopian birr to be a floating rate means every export commodity that we bring into the country will be double the cost, especially in terms of food commodities, in terms of fuel, for example, fertilizers that we import. And therefore, this is going to put a lot of pressure on the Ethiopian economy and the Ethiopian society. The second thing I mentioned earlier are the level of corruption you have in public institutions is unprecedented. And therefore, government has to do something in order to cure this problem. Of course, we'll go later on into how we can challenge this. But definitely, the development of a very assertive civil society and an independent investigative media would be an important medicine for the corruption problems. The other thing will challenge the economy is the contraband trade. That is creating a black economy technically, and therefore government must use its law enforcement to be able to curtail this contraband trade to a large degree. Finally, probably the biggest challenge is economic governance. When we talk about economic governance, we're talking about the level of skills, the level of experience, and the level of performance of our institutions, not just the federal institutions, which includes the Council of Ministers, and then we have the regional governments, then we have the zonal governments, and finally we have the Woreda governments. The Woreda is the place where every investment, every development initiative is undertaken. Education, health, infrastructure, agriculture, mining, all these are performed at the Woreda level. So the level of competence we have at our Woreda institutions is not as good as what we think to be able to undertake all these complex issues that would produce sustainable development and poverty reduction. And therefore, it's very important that we have to strengthen our Woreda institutions, especially in high-performing areas, high-performing Woredas where a lot of food production, mining work that could be undertaken, plus the government's commitment for education and health. And therefore, these are some of the challenges. Add to this is what you call illicit financial flows. A lot of money is flowing out of the country on a yearly basis. If you look at the Global Financial Integrity Report, it's based in Washington, D.C. and supported by the World Bank, IMF, and the United Nations, Ethiopia is losing billions with illicit financial flows. So how do we stop this movement of financial flows through our different public institutions, our banks, our government institutions, our border security? All these are very important. A lot of our products are being exported illegally. Gold, for example, is a good example. After the policy change in the macroeconomic sector, for example, the National Bank has got about $1 billion from gold. But previously, because the gold prices that were given to artisanal miners were so small, they went through the contraband trade. So a small policy change that came has this kind of effect on the bigger economy. And therefore, this policy change must be supported by people who are in institutions, people who have the knowledge, people who have the experience, people who have the willingness to be able to work in an environment where the development of this country should take place. Some of the problems we have is, I'm sure a lot of our bureaucrats are genuine in terms of contributing to Ethiopia's development. But there are some also who would like to benefit out of the system, and these are the ones that create major challenges to our economy. And therefore, coupled with the lack of integral administration, economic management, and economic governance at the world level, I think we'll have to bring in the federal level where much of the regulations, laws, proclamations are being crafted to be able to undertake this development. Take, for example, the issue of the homegrown economic reform program. That program is a great program. There is no question about it. But in order to implement it, we need to have a holistic bureaucratic machinery that's going to contribute to the success of the reform program. On the other side, what we see is instead of contributing to the program, we see in public institutions working against it. And therefore, it's very important to look into these issues for the government.
Let's come to the next question. What are the major structural issues facing Ethiopian economy, specifically be it in the macroeconomy level? And to what extent do you think that the macroeconomic reform has been able to address these structural issues so that the economy could be, in a very healthy manner?
Well, macroeconomic reforms don't bring in immediate results, overnight results. These are things that have been accumulating for a long period of time. When the government of the Derg came, they abolished the market economy completely. And therefore, these market institutions had to be rebuilt. With the EPRDF coming, the EPRDF said they're going to follow the free market system. Of course, there is no free market in principle. All markets have to be moderated and governed by certain rules and regulations that the government brings through its institutions, like the National Bank of Ethiopia, the House of Representatives, the Council of Ministers, and the different institutions that are built to control the economic development. So the recent macroeconomic change have an immediate effect. Like, for example, the income from the diaspora has increased by 26% as soon as the monetary policy was changed. But we're going to see progress in this. With the capital markets now operating quite well, what we'll have is investors don't have to go to the banks for loans to undertake their development. They can sell shares in the Ethiopian Stock Exchange. And also government institutions that have not been performing well under the Ethiopian Investment Holdings now would be going into the capital market to raise additional funds, which means by raising additional funds, they are going to have additional shareholders. These shareholders will have a big impact on the performance of these government institutions, on the what you call state-owned enterprise. And therefore, we're going to wait for some time. One thing we need to look at is the GDP of Ethiopia is growing very well. There is no question about it. In fact, Financial Times, which is normally a conservative newspaper, said that between 2010 and 2020, Ethiopia is the fastest growing country in the world. But because of COVID, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, the challenge we have on public security in Ethiopia, all this coupled, the government is saying that we're growing at 8% now. That is very high. But one thing we need to allay the fears of the confusion that comes from the public is GDP growth is moderated by the total output of the economy. For example, take Ghana. It has only one commodity that is exporting, oil. So the GDP grows at 34%. But that doesn't reflect the life of the people in Guyana as much as it should. So several sectors of the economy could be performing so well that GDP growth comes at 8%. But if we see at the Human Development Report, which is published by the Ethiopian government and the United Nations Development Program, the results are not so good. That is, the Human Development Index is what shows you the real life of people in Ethiopia. How many people are under the poverty line? What are the challenges for the individual families in Ethiopia? And therefore, how do we transform this? That is where the UNDP, the World Bank, and the IMF are trying to support this country to bring in some transformation.
Good. How critical is the development of infrastructure? How critical is the development of infrastructure, particularly in the areas of transport and port access to Ethiopia's macroeconomic growth? For example, recently you might have heard or read about the development of Ethiopia that's making with regard to access of ports. Ethiopian government have been doing. Ethiopia is having a booming or a growing economy. So for that economy, it needs to have access to different ports. There are different agreements reached so far with the Kenyan government in Lamu port, with the Somalia government, and recently the Ankara agreement. So even the Berbera port and with the neighboring countries, in light of this, how critical would it be for the macroeconomic or economic development in general?
Well, you see, the infrastructure is the foundation of any development. And that's why Ethiopia has been building so much infrastructure. Ethiopia has built over 100,000 kilometers of roads. Our railway connection to Djibouti has been completed. Ethiopia has built more than 50 universities to have our young people to go in and study. We have 180 plus colleges, I guess, private. And more than that, we have also the industrial parks. The cities have grown tremendously. If you look at Addis Ababa, the transformation we see is just mind-boggling. So infrastructure is very important. In terms of power generation, which is key to agro-industrial production that's going to support our industrial parks and our special economic zones that are coming up now, energy is very important. But you raised the issue of ports. And I'm glad this is in the debate because this is one of the most intriguing issues in Ethiopian political history because we had ports before, we lost them, and therefore now Ethiopia is paying tremendous amount of cost for using the Djibouti port, for example. But besides that, ports are not only for bringing goods and services. Ports have other important added value to the economy. For example, if we have a port in the Red Sea generates more than 160,000 tons of fish per annum. That would supplement the diet of Ethiopians if we import the fish here or if it's processed and exported. The Red Sea has a tremendous amount of minerals in it. We can exploit these minerals, natural gas, oil. So access to ports is it's an existential question for Ethiopia. And I'm glad these issues are being raised. Of course, there are a lot of challenges. The recent agreement, memorandum of understanding we had with Somaliland created a lot of diplomatic challenge with Somalia. But that's being settled now. I think peace is settling. The president of Somalia will be coming to Ethiopia. And therefore, it's very important to have good relations with our neighbors. So, the Lamu port is one. I think it's an important corridor for Ethiopia's development. Djibouti is another. We have Berbera ports. We have Somalia ports also that we can use. And we have Eritrean ports. So the idea is we have to use our strong diplomatic skills because we've had, Ethiopia has been the center of diplomacy in terms of African development. It's not only creating the African Union or the Organization of African Unity, but Ethiopia was key in the development of non-aligned nations. Ethiopia was probably one of the few members of the League of Nations when it started. A black African country that's a member of a League of Nations in Europe. Ethiopia was the chosen as the center to establish the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa back in 1958. So our diplomatic skills have helped us not only for Ethiopia to stand on its own, but also to help African countries to liberate themselves, number one, and also to be the center of African development. So we have to use our diplomatic skills now to have peace with our neighbors. And there is not much effort in terms of making peace with our neighbors. It's just a question of talking. It's a question of give and take. It's a question of bringing experienced diplomats into the scene to be able to handle this situation. So I see ports are very important for Ethiopia, especially when we're talking about special economic zones. They have to be near ports, because ports, as I said earlier, have tremendous economic potential. But what we also can see in terms of ports development is around ports you develop a lot of special economic zones. They create a lot of employment, they create a lot of industrial growth, they enhance our exports. 78% of Ethiopian products are exported raw. So if we can add value to the coffee that we export, to the tea that we export, to even the minerals that we could be exporting. So as long as our public institutions can be reformed, then Ethiopia's development could be much higher than what we see now. And I see this debate going on. For me, is a very healthy debate in terms of getting the ports and reforming government institutions. And I heard recently the government talking about reforming government institutions, bringing government institutions to accountability. I see our House of Representatives now questioning very seriously the performance of our government ministries. Recently, I saw what I think was quite avant-garde in terms of the debate in the House of Representatives, where they were questioning the Ministry of Mines in terms of its failure to address the mining sector in Ethiopia. So these are for me healthy issues and debates going on. But we have to do more to be able to get the Ethiopian infrastructure to be able to deliver the development we want.
Good. The other aspect, there is what you call AFCFTA, African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is one of the goals of Agenda 2063 of African Union. So this kind of, the Horn of Africa continental or East Africa region integration, accessing a port, the part that Ethiopia could play in this regard, what would it bring? Would it help? Would it facilitate to regional integration if Ethiopia accesses port and diversifies its economy and plays its leading role in this regard? What impact would it have?
Well, Ethiopia,
for the development of AFCFTA.
Ethiopia has been the lead in this dialogue and debate regarding African integration. The very fact that the foundation of the Organization of African Unity is in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, has made Addis Ababa now the political and diplomatic capital of Africa. So when it comes to integration, I remember during the discussions of the Lagos Plans of Action, which was the fundamental decision of African leaders to be able to integrate Africa economically, Ethiopia has contributed a lot to this. And now that the African Free Continental Trade Area is an important opportunity for African countries to be able to trade among themselves. Not only to trade among themselves, but to be able to use their own currencies in terms of their own trade, so that they don't have to use euro or other international currencies for transaction that they don't have, because most African countries have serious shortage of foreign currency because they are loaded with debts that they have to pay. And therefore, for African integration, I think the Ethiopian economy is well integrated, at least at the sub-region level. Ethiopia and Djibouti have been well integrated now through infrastructure and trade. Somaliland, Somalia, Sudan have been also well integrated into the Ethiopian economy. We have very good infrastructure. We were importing oil from Sudan at one point in time and other commodities. So we have good infrastructure connections. Unfortunately, Sudan is now in crisis. South Sudan, there is now work that's going on in terms of building the infrastructure. Ethiopia is also exporting power to Sudan, Djibouti, and now, of course, I saw some agreements up to Tanzania. So Ethiopia is trying to integrate itself. More importantly, now, in the absence of infrastructure linking African countries, Ethiopian Airlines is the only agency that we have in terms of connecting Africa. Literally, all African countries are connected through Ethiopian Airlines. So what we lost through the African Growth and Opportunity Act, what we call AGOA, now can be supplemented with the African Free Continental Trade Area, where we have tariff-free exports that have to be implemented within the continent. So for me, a lot of African countries, a lot of people traveling from African countries to China and Dubai, I see them buying a lot of goods from these countries. Now we can produce them here. Our special economic zones, our industrial parks can be the harbingers for this kind of work. And therefore, the fact that our special economic zones are now being developed, for me, is a good sign that we're going to integrate very well into the African trade scene. I recently attended a workshop at the Skylight Hotel by the Industrial Parks Development. And I also gave my ideas there in a panel and in a speech. And the special economic zones are going to be our future in terms of building our agro-industrial base, adding assets to our exports, and also, especially now, if we start exploiting our mineral potential, then definitely these are going to be game changers in our inter-African trade. And therefore, I think Ethiopia is in a good state. As I said, the four major challenges that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, if we can address them, Ethiopia has no problem implementing its homegrown economic reform program fully.
Good. How do you view the trade balance of Ethiopia with our neighboring countries? For example, you were saying, underlining AFCFTA, Ethiopian Airlines is doing a great job, and now Ethiopia is exporting power, energy to Tanzania, Kenya, and Sudan as well. So I think the trade balance that we have with the neighboring countries by itself impacts our economy and really has its own impact on our diplomacy as well. So how do you view Ethiopia's trade balance in this regard with its neighboring countries?
Well, Ethiopia's trade balance is not...
And what policy adjustments could be made?
Yeah, well, you know, Ethiopia's trade balance, we import about $20 billion worth of goods and services every year. So that means, you know, we have to match that with our exports. That's why we talked about the special economic zones in terms of being export zones where we add assets to our exports, for example, coffee, sesame, and other products. The second thing is in terms of bringing equilibrium to our trade balance, these industrial parks should be able to manufacture goods and services that we are importing from abroad. Some areas, like, for example, petroleum, as long as we don't have petroleum, we have to import it. But many areas, in terms of food imports, in terms of services that we import from other countries, can be replaced through import substitution here by our industrial parks. That was the whole idea. We took this Eurobond loan of $1 billion to build our industrial parks and also to build the 11 sugar factories. So the sugar factories are a good example. Now we're importing hundreds of millions worth of sugar and edible oil. If the 11 sugar factories have been performing now, we could save that amount of money and our trade balance would come to some kind of equilibrium. So this needs a very serious thought in terms of how we can do this. It's not just a question of an export-oriented economy, but we have to have also import substitution, where we can produce things here for our own consumption within Ethiopia, and also for export to African countries under the tariff-free African Free Continental Trade Area. And these are things that we need to look into very seriously within the macroeconomy discussions that we have within the government. And for this, the pillars of any trade balance are the private sector. There is no question about it. Government's main task is to ensure that the country's borders are protected, that people have been protected from going down below the poverty line. Government should ensure access to education and health for every citizen. Of course, governments by themselves are developmental. For example, we saw during COVID, China, the United States were providing a lot of support to their citizens. So it doesn't mean that it's only private sector that's running the economy. But private sector participation in the Ethiopian economy is very, very low. The government has issued so many declarations in terms of promoting the private sector. There was even a capacity building within the Ministry of Capacity Building at one time to promote the private sector, but these have remained on paper. They have not gone into the mainstream government function. Therefore, when we talk about investors coming into Ethiopia, no investor from abroad would come here with dollars sticking out of their pockets, They would come here and ask, what kind of banks do you have to give us loans? So the fact that now foreign banks are coming into Ethiopia would solve that problem. So the entire macroeconomic policy arena was really in a very difficult situation until recently. So now that we have the necessary macroeconomic policies in place, what's next is how do we implement them? That's very important. And this is also important for our trade balance, where we can have a positive trade balance. Mind you, China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. Within 2 decades, China is the second largest economy in the world. In terms of purchasing power parity, China is the #1 economy in the world, above the United States. So this is doable. We can do it. Also here, we have the population. We have a young population. We have over 70 million hectares of arable land. Our rivers are exporting 120 billion cubic meters of water on the average annually. And therefore, coupled with the young population we have, our mining and agricultural industry can bring in the trade balance to equilibrium. Even we can have a positive trade balance. The only thing is, how do we focus on this? As I said, the economic governance issues at different levels of government has to be improved to a point where we can say we have reached a position where we can do things properly, where our development work can be streamlined. One of the challenges that I see within our waredas is most of these waredas traditionally have been filled in by government people close to the government, probably political party members. This has been during they have been assigning their own people. During the last 30 years, public institutions are filled in with loyal people. I think what we need to do now is meritocracy has to be the #1 issue. People have to be put in different positions with their merit, not with their loyalty. At the end of the day, governments change from time to time, but the country will remain here, and therefore the next generation in Ethiopia has to have a country that we think is more sustainable than it's now. And given the history that we're going through now, the kind of conflicts we have in the country, it's very important that we give hope to our children in terms of creating a country where there is prosperity, which the government is trying to proclaim very widely.
What are the key barriers to Ethiopia's international trade, and to what extent would this macroeconomic reform solve these barriers? You were mentioning that of the foreign currency one, but if there are other issues.
The macroeconomic reform in terms of policy reform, for me is, as I said, avant-garde. It's revolutionary. And I see also a debate going on. Should we have taken these macroeconomic reforms at this time, or should we wait? But how long do we wait? We waited for 30 years to invite foreign banks to come into Ethiopia. We waited for 30 years to be able to float the Ethiopian birr on the market rate, the interest on the market rate. We've waited 30 years to re-establish the Ethiopian stock exchange and capital markets. Mind you, Ethiopia had capital markets before. Most of the companies under Emperor Haile Selassie were formed under the capital markets. We had more than 6,000 of them, companies that have been listed on the Ethiopian. It was called a share market at that time. Even Ethiopian Airlines, until recently, I used to see it as a share company. Of course, the major shares were held by the government, but it was open for any investor, Ethiopian or outside, to be able to invest on Ethiopian Airlines at that time. But during the Derg and during the last 30 years, the commodity exchange, for some odd reason, was completely ignored. In fact, it was not even promoted. The whole idea of a commodity exchange is normally people go to banks, they take loans, and they start business. But under the stock exchange now, people who have, especially startups, who have great idea, can go into the stock market. They can put their prospectus there and raise capital for their work. And technically, financial intermediation becomes much more prolific, and young people can raise funds from here, locally or internationally. One thing about the capital markets is, for example, if we say we're going to liberalize the companies under the Ethiopian Investment Holdings, people in Tokyo, in Frankfurt, in New York, they don't have to come here and get an investor license. They can buy their shares there through the internet. This is how this capital markets work. We have now more than 357 stock exchanges around the world. All these are now interconnected and they work together. And this is how you can generate a lot of money coming in. Imagine China and UAE are two good examples. Within a period of 30 years, Dubai has become the financial center of the Middle East and Africa. And China has become the greatest economy in the world, overwhelming even the developed economies in the West. These are the instruments and pillars that they built very meticulously to be able to reach where they are today. And for me, the macroeconomic reforms that are coming now, in terms of monetary policy, in terms of fiscal policy, are going to be the foundation and pillars of our future growth. It might take time. There might be hiccups in the way, and the challenges I have mentioned earlier. All of this, if we can challenge them from time to time, then these macroeconomic reforms will bring in tremendous value to the Ethiopian economy.
Your valuable insights. Well, viewers, that was all what we have for you. We have stayed here in the headquarters of African Humanitarian Action with the prominent professor, Konstantinos Berhe. He's a prominent economist as well. So we have been able to highlight very important aspects of the macroeconomic aspects of Ethiopia, and as well the macroeconomic reform vis-a-vis the different port access agreements that Ethiopia has made. So I hope that our interview has helped you to have a nice insight of what Ethiopia is having in its economic activities.